long time ago, I lived in the remote mountain town of Costilla, New Mexico. It was very small. My family had lived there for several generations, and the house I lived in was the house that my grandparents lived in. In small towns, everyone knows everyone. And being that our family had always resided there, I really did know everyone. So that's what makes the events that occurred very unusual. It all started with strange things being left on our doorstep, things like unusual bottles of liquid and broken glass. Sometimes we would find that someone had left chalk sigils or drawings in the sand outside of our home. It was obvious that whatever was happening was intentional, that someone had purposely left these things for us to find. But what we didn't know was why, and that totally creeped me out. I didn't mention my worries to anyone outside of the family. The things that were happening were just so unusual, and I didn't know who I could trust. Our town was small, but it was very religious. Everyone in town was Catholic, so every single person would be seen wearing rosaries. No one left home without them. So as strange things kept happening, I refused to go anywhere without my rosary. Even when at home, time would come and go, and so would the strange items. We were very scared of what was to come. Were these omens? Were they symbols of what was to come? Eventually, we found something far more unsettling. On the day it all happened, it was a nice day outside, so I wanted to open the windows and get some housework done. I had laundry to do. The house needed a good dusting. And a friend had brought us some lovely tomato plants to put in the garden. I wasn't naive. I knew to be cautious of the gifts. But honestly, nothing bad ever came of those tomato plants. They were good plants that gave us plenty of good, healthy tomatoes. Anyways, I did a lot of the indoor work and moved to the outside garden. I wanted to get the tomato plants in the ground as soon as possible, but I still had a lot of cleaning up to do in the garden beds. I anticipated being out there for some time, and I had spent 3 good hours out there until I finally stumbled upon them. I was at the side of my house, and I was cleaning up some debris out of the pots and beds. I moved towards the windowsill as I had some pots and a small bed near the window. This window went straight into the kitchen. I had spent hours and hours at the window every day between cooking multiple meals and washing the dishes. So if something was left there, I would have noticed immediately. But I must not have, because when I go to clean up the windowsill, I find 5 small figurines. Each of the figures was about 3 inches tall, and each had what appeared to be human hair, and looked like people I knew, my 4 siblings and myself. The scary thing was that the hair looked like our actual hair. I could recognize a clump of my own hair from a mile away, because of the unique curl it had, and I knew without a doubt that this doll looked like me and had my hair. I immediately went to my sibling and told them what I had found. We all agreed that the best thing we could do was burn the dolls. So that night we lit a bonfire and we threw the dolls in. We made a grand night of it all, but I suppose the celebration was a bit too soon. When my brother went to put out the fire, he realized that the dolls had not been affected by it. Not one bit. It was as if the dolls were never touched by fire. I know it's hard to believe that little dolls made of wood would not have burned in that fire. Trust me, I don't want to believe it either. But it happened. We knew that something beyond our understanding was happening. We knew that these dolls were intended for harm. So, we decided to bury the dolls far from our home. But then months later, my siblings and I started getting sick. One by one, we all started to fall terribly ill. We didn't know what was happening to us. The doctors couldn't explain it. My brother, a very spiritual man, suggested that we see a medicine doctor that helped one of his friends in the past. When we went, the shaman explained that we were ill from a type of spiritual darkness. In that space with him, we felt that it was safe to describe our experiences to him, and we told him about everything that had happened. The bottle of liquid, the glass, the sigils. The man explained that those things weren't actually what was bad. We were shocked to learn that they were there to protect us. However, the dolls were not. The dolls had a different purpose. The dolls were what had made us sick. The medicine doctor suggested leaving the dolls in the ground, that our hair was the main anchor to us, and that it would eventually decay in the earth. And with that, he performed rituals meant to help heal our spirits. I wasn't sure how much I really believed in what he did, but I was so worried that I didn't care what we did as long as it helped us get better. And miraculously, it did. Within days, we all regained our health, but we never got answers. We never found out who brought the dolls. We never found out how they got our hair. We never found out who was there protecting us. All of these things I still do not know. All I know is that my kids and their kids have all learned. Of all the generations of my family left on this earth, none of us dares to throw their hair in the trash. I explained to them what happened. And I explained that the trash is the only place I can think of that the demons could have found our hair. And then I have them burn their hair so no one, no matter what their intentions are, can do again what has been done to us. When I was a teenager, maybe 16, my parents decided to go on a summer trip to Big Bear. It started off great, but it turned into the freakiest vacation of my life. My family is very outdoorsy. My parents and little sisters love camping and walking trails any chance they get. I like it too, but it's not really my idea of a relaxing getaway. My parents planned a week of outside stuff like hiking and lake swimming that had my sisters bouncing off the walls. As for me, I was looking forward to kicking back and enjoying the resort's amenities like the jacuzzi and workout room. Since we had separate bedrooms, I figured we'd get along fine. When we got there, the check-in folks told us about the resort's bear and wildlife precautions. It was mostly just about dealing with food trash and keeping an eye out just in case. Not really a big deal. The resort was also right next to some campgrounds. Our suite was on the 3rd floor, and the balcony overlooked the campgrounds, which was cool because it was a nice view, and we could watch the campers. There was this one group of campers who'd set up pretty close to us. They had this thing where they'd sing around the campfire in the evening. If that sounds like a nightmare, it really wasn't. They were solid musicians. Nobody just hauls a violin on a camping trip unless they know what they're doing. Anyway, they'd start playing around 8 or so, and we'd get treated to guitar and banjo, along with that violin for a couple of hours. I liked reading while I listened to them. They always wrapped up by 10, probably out of respect for the resort's mandatory quiet hours. On the 4th day of our vacation, I was reading on the couch after dinner while my sisters and parents played a board game. The windows were open for airflow because the building didn't have air conditioning, so it was easy to hear the nightly music. I must have drifted off. I woke up about 45 minutes later and something seemed weird. It took me a second to realize it was because the music had stopped. There was still over an hour left before quiet hours, so it was strange that they stopped so early. I shrugged it off. I figured they'd gotten tired or maybe just run out of songs. No biggie, but it was a little disappointing. The next morning, I decided to start my day in the workout room. As I was leaving, I saw a reusable water bottle sitting behind one of the treadmills. It was one of those nice steel ones, cobalt blue and shiny. I knew whoever left it would be back, so I ran over to turn it in at the front desk. On my way out of the lobby, I passed by a couple employees coming in the front doors. They were whispering to each other and looked worried. I couldn't make out much, but I clearly heard one of them mention something about last night. I wanted to ask them what they were talking about, but I wasn't sure they'd tell a teenager, so I just went back to our suite. Turns out I didn't need to wonder too long, because the suite's landline rang while we were eating lunch. My dad picked it up and listened for a minute before hanging up. He said it was an automated notice from the front desk. Basically, we weren't supposed to freak out, but someone had seen a young bear out in the campground. The guests didn't need to worry, but please make sure to fully clean up if we cook or eat anything outside. They also said to avoid spending a lot of time in the surrounding areas at night and to report any more sightings immediately. That night there was no singing, and that's when I figured that the campers must have seen the bear yesterday. They were probably staying quiet tonight just in case. It was disappointing because I'd really liked their music, but what can you do? I went to bed without a problem, but around midnight I woke up to a loud noise. It sounded like some guy shouting or cheering, like a woo sound. It only lasted a couple seconds, but I was kind of mad. The quiet hours existed for a reason, and there's nothing I hate more than inconsiderate neighbors who wake me up in the middle of the night. If I hadn't managed to get back to sleep pretty quickly, I would have been even more annoyed, but I guess mountain air is good for tiring you out. Next morning, I decided to go for a quick jog around the area instead of hitting the weight room, so after I told my parents where I was going, I headed out. On the way, I passed the entrance to the campgrounds. There was a group of people loading tents and bags into their cars. I recognized a few instrument cases in the pile, so I knew these guys must have been the singing campers. They all looked like they hadn't slept all night. They looked really nervous, too. After I got back to the room, I ate breakfast with my family before heading out to explore all the touristy stuff. There was time for a swim in the resort pool, too. After that, we had to start packing so we could be ready for checkout time the next morning. My sisters wanted to go on a night hike since there hadn't been any bear sightings that day, and they nagged enough that my parents gave in. I was tired from the day's activities plus my morning jog. I stayed home so I could go to bed early. I fell asleep easily since I was pretty tired, but I woke up suddenly because I heard someone shouting. I don't remember what time it was exactly, but I do remember being annoyed. It was past the start of quiet hours, but it sounded like some guy whooping and yelling. It must have been the same guy that woke me up last night. But unlike last night, he wasn't just yelling for a couple of seconds, he kept going. I decided to go out on the balcony to see if I could figure out where the yelling was coming from, and hopefully tell the guy off. Once I got outside, I could definitely tell he was somewhere in the campground in front of me. He sounded close too. It was 1997 and I was camping with my sister at Craig Lake State Park in northern Michigan. It was the middle of summer and unfortunately we're expecting a heat wave on the exact week of our trip. We had both taken off from work already, so we decided to go anyway and try to enjoy it. We planned to sleep in our hammocks and brought bug nets to hang above them. If you've never been to the Midwest, we have mosquitoes here that are just huge. We brought a tent too, as it looked like we might have a little rain in the middle of the week. But neither of us wanted to sleep in a tent when the nighttime temperature didn't look like it was going to get below 80. Our campsite was a hike-in spot, but it was only about 4 miles from the parking lot. We were both sweating buckets by the time we hauled all our gear to the site, and I wondered if we would be able to survive the week or if we would roast alive. Most of the week went fine. Very hot and a little miserable, but we didn't run into anything strange. When I hear people tell stories like this, and there is almost always something they missed in hindsight, but here, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing at all. On the 5th day, it had begun to rain about halfway through the day. It started out as a little rain but got significantly worse as the day progressed. It was just starting to get bad as we returned from our morning hike, so we took down our hammocks and set up the tent. By dinner time, it was pouring. We obviously couldn't get a fire started, so we cooked dinner in the vestibule on a little butane stove. The tent had started leaking about an hour or so later, and then the wind picked up. There was a pool of water on the floor of our tent when we decided we'd rather hike the 4 miles back to the car. We figured we could probably find a hotel room in town, and if not, at least we would be dry in the car. The trail to the parking lot was well marked, and we should have easily found our way back. The rain and wind were making it hard to see, so when we thought we saw the red taillights of another car, we headed straight for it. It looked exactly like taillights, bright red and glowing in the distance. It looked maybe 60 or 70 feet away from where we were on the trail. The trail had gotten soupy from all the rain, and it became difficult to tell if we were on it or not. We tried to use the light as a guide to follow back to the parking lot, but we ended up stepping directly into a swamp. The sudden change in footing surprised us both, and we fell forward into the mud. It was that sticky type of mud that holds you in. I don't think it was quicksand, but it was difficult to get out of. When we had climbed back onto the trail, we sat there on the ground staring at this light that appeared to be dead center in this swamp. My sister was worried it was a car that had driven off the road, but it wasn't sinking and we didn't hear anyone screaming for help. I didn't know what it was, but something felt off about the whole situation. If it was a car, it's not like we would be able to help them anyway. We barely got ourselves out of the mud. We continued on in the direction we hoped was the parking lot. We decided we would call the police about the possible stuck car when we got back to ours. The rain got heavier, if that was even possible, and the strange red light faded into the distance. Not more than 10 minutes later, we saw another light, red, about 3 feet off the ground. Looked just like the taillight of a car. This time it was in the middle of a forest. I recognized this area. We were almost to the parking lot, but this particular area was heavily wooded. No way would a car even fit between the trees in here. I said it can't be a car, that it must be a person with a red lantern or a red headlight. My sister called out to see if anyone needed help. No answer. My sister wanted to go in there and see what it was, but I definitely did not. But the longer I stared at the light, the more I wanted to investigate it too. I felt strange watching it, almost like I was in a trance. And then the light moved. It dropped to the ground. It was maybe 1 foot off the ground now. It came towards us, slithering like a snake through the trees. I had an overwhelming sense of dread. My sister and I didn't need to say anything, we just ran. I looked back to see the red light following us, but it stopped when it got to the edge of the trail. I never figured out what it was. My sister didn't have any explanation for it either. We did call the non-emergency police line when we got back to our car and reported a car possibly stuck in the swamp, but her and I both knew that whatever was out there wasn't tail lights from a car. I spent a few years working on a cattle ranch in South Dakota. It was near the Badlands, but not near enough to be scenic. The land was flat, rolling prairies. There were groves of trees in areas, but for the most part, nothing but open sky. The pay wasn't great, but housing was included. I was in my early 20s, so it was a good enough setup for me. Now, I was never one of those people who believed in the paranormal or the supernatural or any of that stuff. I was never religious. I only believed in things that I could see, hear, and touch. Despite my skeptical nature, I always liked listening to local myths and legends, but I never searched for truth in any of them. One such legend was that of the Thunder Horse. It's an old Sioux story to explain the origin of storms. Supposedly, this Thunder Horse was some ancient creature that used to roam the plains of the Midwest. The creature was described as being from a time long in the past. The Thunder Horse, for some reason, disappeared from the plains, but every once in a while, it would return to hunt bison. The sound of its hooves made thunder as it chased its prey across the plains. As the herd of bison ran, their hooves would strike rocks and send sparks across the sky. That was the lightning. From what I remember of the story, people wouldn't often witness the Thunder Horse, but they would find its bones from time to time. Sometimes the ranch hands would hang out together in the evenings after work and tell local legends like this one. We would talk about our families, silly memories of our youth, and how much work sucked. More often than not, we ended up talking about our animal encounters in the wild. Who had seen bears, wolves, moose, and bobcats? None of us had ever seen a mountain lion. There was a ranch hand that was with us for only a few weeks. I'll call him Cole for the sake of this story. He was a quiet guy, maybe a little strange, but he was a hard worker. I never had any problem with him. I knew he didn't like storms and would stay indoors at night if there was any possibility of rain. Pretty odd for someone who works outdoors, but I didn't want to pry. Cole didn't really talk unless he had to. On the rare occasions he would hang out with us after work, he just sort of sat there and listened. One day we were talking about the bison herds in Custer State Park. I don't remember how the conversation got there, but Cole asked us if we knew the legend of the Thunder Horse. He was sitting there opposite me across the fire and wrapped in a wool blanket. I didn't know Cole well, and he was sometimes hard to get a read on, but he looked afraid in that moment. He told us he saw a thunder horse one time. It was in the middle of a storm, and he said it was the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen. I don't think any of us believed him, but the rest of the guys thought he was strange enough that they kept their thoughts to themselves. Cole left a couple of weeks later. I don't know if he quit or was fired. He was just gone one day, and we didn't think anything more about it. The following summer, I had all but forgotten about Cole. We had a raging thunderstorm pass through the plains. The weather radar said it was going to be a bad one. We typically leave our horses outside 24/7, but the winds were predicted to be ungodly, so we were setting up panels in the barns to make stalls for all of them. We were cutting it close to get the barn ready in time. The rain was already pelting me as I was leading the last of the horses in. And looking at the winds, I would be surprised if the roofs were still on all the buildings come morning. I could see the cattle pasture out of the corner of my eye. I couldn't see it well because of the weather, but I could tell they were upset. I figured it was the storm. There wasn't much I could do for them except hope they didn't bust down the fence. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and I saw what was upsetting the cattle. The 2 horses I was leading spooked and got away from me. And I didn't blame them. There was a beast in the cattle pasture that stood about 8 feet high. It looked prehistoric. That's the only way I can think to describe it. I only saw it during flashes of lighting. It had hooves, but it looked more like a giant rhinoceros than it did a horse. It looked like something you would find roaming the earth in a time with mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. Its hair was pure white. It was longer than a horse's hair and kind of shaggy. It was about the size of a moose, but it was like no other animal I had ever seen. I saw it maybe 6 times when the lighting lit up the sky and allowed me a good look at the beast. The next flash of lighting and it was gone. I thought I had some type of hallucination, but then I remembered Cole's story. I so wish I knew where he ended up because I'd love to talk to him about all of this. Now I can't explain what the Thunder Horse actually is or where it came from, or if that is even what I saw. For all I know, it could be some prehistoric ghost. Something happened to me over the summer. I live in Montana, a state known for wide-open ranges, high mountains, and best of all, trout fishing. I guess I've seen a river runs through it too many times because I spend nearly every single free moment of my time out on nearby rivers and streams fly fishing. There are about a dozen different bodies of water within an hour's drive, and each one has quality trout fishing. While Montana is relatively unpopulated, some of the more popular places can get a little crowded during the busy months. Every serious fisherman has their own secluded secret spot, and I'm no exception. I found it a few years ago, and have seen maybe 2 other people on the stream in all that time. I was there on the day that this story takes place. It's about a 2-hour drive from my home in Polson, so I left the house a little bit before dawn. I had fishing buddies, but never showed anyone else this secret spot. After the drive and a further hour hike, I was on the river. It was a clear day, and the river is wide enough that you can see pretty far, both up and downstream. I hit some of my usual spots: deep pools, downed trees, and some shallow rapids. The morning was warm, and it was beginning to heat up quickly as the sun rose. Trout tend to get lethargic in warm water, and I was afraid it was going to be a waste of a day. I really didn't want to leave empty-handed, so I decided to walk upstream a bit. Maybe I would find a mountain stream runoff, which would make the water in the vicinity a little cooler. I fished my way upstream maybe 2 or 3 miles, alternating between walking along the bank and wading in the river. I had never really explored this stretch of the river before, and the land before me became wilder and more beautiful with every step. And that's saying something for Montana. Despite the captivating scenery, I caught a strange feeling that I couldn't quite seem to shake. It felt like I was walking into an area where I didn't belong, like I had stepped back into a time when man was at the bottom of the food chain. The rocks and boulders became more jagged and uneven, and even the trees seemed to loom larger, like towering sentinels peering down at a clumsy intruder. I did my best to ignore the feeling and just kept casting out, hoping my fly would get noticed. Fortunately, the water became a little shallower, and I was able to wade further out into the water and create some more casting room. It was while I was standing in the center of the river, mid-cast, when I noticed it. Across the river on the opposite bank, one of the trees began moving, and then another. Shaking violently, I could see leaves and pine cones falling from above to the forest floor. Something was moving from deep in the forest, heading in my direction. And whatever it was big enough to make a 60-foot tree shake and sway as if from a hurricane. I yanked all my line in with my hand and grabbed it up in a bundle. No doubt it was a tangled mess, but I had bigger problems to worry about. Wading through water is tough, and I probably wasn't going to get back to the shoreline before this thing emerged from the other side, but what choice did I have? I turned and came as close to a run as I could. The footing was slippery, and I kept having to feel around with my feet to find the next safe stepping spot. I kept pushing forward and could begin hearing a massive thump coming from behind. It was getting louder with each passing heartbeat. Now terrified, I threw my $500 rod into the water and began taking long, risky steps, just praying I didn't step into a hole or slip into the water. Plenty of fishermen have drowned after falling in and having their waders filled with water. I had almost reached the other bank when I heard a thunderous crash behind me. I could help but turn and look. As if out of a fantasy book, a literal giant stood before me. It was at least half the height of the 50-foot pine trees. A patchwork garment of a dozen elk skins covered it from the waist down. The gargantuan fist held down at both of its sides seemed as if it could envelop me whole. I was somewhere between full terror and complete awe. A living creature of legend was standing in front of me, and its pumpkin-sized eyes locked with mine and held my gaze. Then it opened its mouth. This was the only time in my life that I can say that I felt a noise. Inhaling a tremendous breath, the creature roared a single explosive word, "Go." Mimicking the size of the creature, the single word was long and expansive. I hadn't initially comprehended that the thing had just spoken. As I stood unresponsive, mouth agape, standing in water up to my thighs, the creature stooped and uprooted a 2-ton boulder from the rocky shore. Single-handed, it reared back and then launched it like a catapult, the stone monolith slamming into the water only 10 yards away. A shower of water, rocks, and wood rained down on me, and I had to cover my hands with my head. Several smaller stones ricocheted from the tossed boulder, hitting me all over, which later turned into nasty purple welts. Snapping out of my stupefaction and realizing just how threatening this situation was, I began racing towards the shoreline, kicking my legs high out of the water like a flamingo. Back turned to the monster, I felt another impact somewhere behind me, globs of water soaking me even further. I was breathing hard and felt a surge of relief when my foot hit the rocky bank. I climbed out without looking back and raced towards the tree line as quickly as my soaked clothing would let me. I ran 30 feet into the wood before tripping and falling face first onto the ground. When I stood up and turned back towards the river, I could see the immense creature lumbering back into the forest on the far side of the water. I stood watching and listening, and its loud thumps slowly faded away, and I could no longer see the tips of the trees swaying from its passing. I quickly returned to my truck and went home. I know this sounds far-fetched, like a child's fairy tale or something from Lord of the Rings, but it happened. I thought about calling the police or even the media, but in the end, decided not to. This thing could easily have killed me, but all it did was chase me away. It just wanted solitude and to be left alone, something I could relate to. That's why I went there in the first place. I won't be returning to disturb it. Maybe there are things in the world, creatures and such, that should be left alone. Maybe we should stop trying to find them.